Welcome, everyone, to this afternoon's EMIT webinar on Iranian influence operations in the United States, featuring Gabriel Noronha. I want to thank you all for joining and supporting EMIT, and we really appreciate your continued support. As you can imagine, during this very difficult time, we're quite busy working on the Hill to ensure the continued support of Israel, which has been really unprecedented, and our work, I think, is contributing to that. So we appreciate your support. I also wanted to share and remind everybody to save the date for December 5th for our Rays of Light in the Darkness dinner gala in Washington, D.C., and we hope you all can join us there. I'm going to just dive right in because we have a lot to talk about. Gabriel Noronha is the Executive Director of POLARIS National Security, of which I'm a board member. And he is also a fellow with JINSA's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. From 2019 to 2021, he served as the special advisor for Iran at the Department of State, where he coordinated policy and directed the department's communications and congressional affairs for Iran. From 2017 to 19, he worked as the special assistant to the Senate Armed Services Committee under Chairman John McCain and Jim Inhofe, helping write and pass the annual national security legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act. Gabriel previously worked for U.S. Senator Kelly Ayotte from 2015 to 2016. He works on a wide range of national security and political projects, and he speaks and conducts research in Spanish, Russian, and Mandarin. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, Gabriel.
Thanks for having me. And I will apologize in advance. I'm here in the Senate, just came out of a briefing. So if there's some background noise, I'm not in my normal locale.
Well, we appreciate all the work you're doing. I know how hard you're working throughout this time as well. So I'm going to dive right in. And before we get into the Iranian influential information campaign, I want to talk about the Hamas terrorists that invaded Israel. The Wall Street Journal reported that Iran was directly involved with the planning, training, and funding of the attacks, and in fact, gave the green light for the operation days before it occurred. The Biden administration to this day refuses to acknowledge Iran's direct involvement, claiming there's no evidence to support that claim, leading to Omri Sirin tweeting, "Team Biden again behaving as Iran's lawyer." And Biden mouthpiece, the New York Times, even published a ridiculous report claiming that the mullahs were taken by surprise at the attack. I think by the end of our discussion, our listeners will understand why Biden doesn't want the public to believe that Iran had a direct role in this, since it would make his administration complicit as well. But before we get into the specifics of the influence operations in the U.S., I think it's important for you to explain to our audience Iran's role in the Hamas attack on Israel and why the Obama-Biden policies of Iranian appeasement, including the various steps that have led to perhaps 100 billion or more since Biden took office, flowing to the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, empowering it to the point of invading Israel through the Hamas proxy. So can you just share a little bit on that before we dive into the other topic?
Certainly. So first of all, the idea that Ayatollah Khamenei woke up on Saturday, October 8th, and saw the attacks and was surprised is simply not plausible. Iran provides 93% of all Hamas funding. That is, again, if any of you fund anything, 93%, you have command and control, and you know everything that they are going to do. I can't speak to the intelligence because I no longer receive intelligence, but it doesn't take too much to be able to determine they are fully responsible for everything to be that is done here. A little bit on that funding, because that number is so important. Historically, Iran gave Hamas $100 million a year for their support. In 2019 and 2020, during maximum pressure, that was reduced significantly, and Hamas had to go under a austerity plan. What we saw is in 2022, after 2 years of sanctions relief from the Biden administration, that number increased from less than 100 million to 350 million. That gave Hamas the confidence, the funding, the equipment to be able to conduct these attacks. Without that funding, it would not have been possible. And so that is the first and foremost thing. And look, Iran has been training Hamas fighters since 1992. There are reports that they even trained 6,500 fighters at IRGC bases in southern Iran in the 2000s. So they are ultimately culpable here in the fact that the president, I respect a lot of what the president has said on Israel. He's been a lot stronger than many of us expected, and he's to be applauded for that. But the fact that he has yet to utter the word Iran in almost any of his speeches is highly inappropriate, and I think it allows Iran to get away with the deniability that it sees here.
Yeah, I think we all noticed that we didn't hear Iran, and I just want to point out something that today is the official day that the sanctions, the UN sanctions on Iran's ballistic missile program lifted. And we had the ability to block that at the UN, I believe. Did we not, Gabriel? And instead the Biden administration, again, I agree with you. The things he said on Israel have been quite strong, and I commend him for that as well. But, you know, Iran's a big issue here. And if he's going to continue down the path of appeasement in hopes of signing some sort of agreement or not signing and keeping the agreement secret, what about the UN sanctions relief today?
So the background here for viewers is from 2006 to 2009, the UN imposed permanent restrictions on a number of Iranian activities, from selling and buying conventional arms like planes and tanks, to an arms embargo against Iran selling and buying ballistic missiles, drones, and anything related to nuclear delivery systems. In 2015, President Obama negotiated a deal which set those restrictions to expire today, October 18th, 2023. Those restrictions, as of midnight last night, have now expired. Here's what that means. What that means is that Iran could buy an ICBM from China, which could hit New York City or Paris or Los Angeles. And if they have a nuclear weapon, they can attach a nuclear weapon to that. It means that they can legally sell ballistic missiles and suicide drones to Russia for their war against Ukraine. And it means they can legally buy and sell ballistic missiles and suicide drones to Hamas and Hezbollah as well. This is something that was extremely concerning. The Trump administration saw this happening, and there is a legal right in the 2015 deal where any nation, including the United States, could snap back those UN sanctions and permanently restore them to their original status from the 2000s. That's what the Trump administration did in August and September of 2020. It was a contested process. The other parties to the JCPOA argued that we no longer had that right. We argued that we did. And so we snapped back those sanctions, but others sort of pretended that we hadn't. Biden's first act in office was to rescind that snapback. And what that did is that restored Iran's ability to legally export arms to countries, and it set us on this path that is leading us today, where those ballistic missile and drone restrictions are expiring. Right now, Europe, France, Germany, and the UK could go to the UN right now and snap back those sanctions so they'd be in place. They have refused to do so out of the concern that it would allegedly provoke Iran. That is the argument they used in 2020. And they said, and I think this is important because I want to tell you guys exactly what they said to us. They said, if we snap back those sanctions, we are afraid that Iran will go and enrich uranium at 20%. Well, Iran went and enriched at 20% anyways. Then they told us we're afraid to snap back because Iran might go to 60% in uranium enrichment. And they did anyways, and Europe did not. Now Europe's line is that they might go to Iran might go to 90% enrichment if they snap back. Well, Iran has gone to 84% enrichment, and Europe has still not snapped back. The reality here is Europe has been deterred by Iranian threats, and they refuse to respond. So at any moment now, Europe could fix this, but they refuse to, and this is complete failure of leadership here. Same kind of activity and weakness that allowed Putin to go invade Ukraine, because he thought rightly that there wouldn't be much of a response from Europe.
Okay, thank you for that, Gabriel. I'm going to now turn to the Iran Experts Initiative. At the end of September, there was a major story that broke that revealed that senior U.S. government officials and former top advisors were part of the Islamic Republic of Iran's Iran Experts Initiative. I'm going to be referring to it as IEI. The report was based on materials gathered by Iran International that revealed emails showing government officials' participation in this secret Iranian government influence scheme. Before getting into the specifics of the individual government officials involved, I'd like you to spend a few minutes sharing with our audience what exactly the IEI is, when and also why it was established, and how long you believe it may have infiltrated U.S.-Iranian policymakers. You've pointed out that President Rouhani's propaganda machine was announced to his cabinet in a meeting in March of 2020, but in fact, wasn't the IEI actually established in 2014?
Yes, thank you. So back in 2014, this is under the former administration of President Hassan Rouhani and his foreign minister, Javad Zarif. They made a very strong and stated effort to basically try to infiltrate and convince the U.S. and European publics to downplay the threat from Iran and to upplay basically Iranian claims. And in fact, this was a propaganda network not trained at sort of your general Twitter users or Facebook users, but at the highest echelons of policymakers and influencers who shape U.S. and European strategic thinking. And they did this by reaching out to a number of Iranian diaspora members, so either Iranian Europeans or Iranian Americans, who are now at top think tanks. And the whole point was to inculcate them into Iranian talking points and to share Iranian perspectives instead of advancing the views and values of the United States and Europe. These efforts have continued from 2014 all the way through the end of the Rouhani administration in 2021. So the propaganda network, which Rouhani announced publicly in spring of 2020, is part of this. It's part of the whole program of Foreign Minister Zarif's and his aims there. What we saw with the election of President Ibrahim Raisi in 2021 was a group of, again, hardliners. They're all hardliners, but these are kind of ultra hardliners who have zero interest in rapprochement or any relations with the West. And so they've done a lot less of this. In fact, they've actually sort of attacked some of these individuals because they want relations between Iran and the West. And the current administration has no interest in that whatsoever. But the reality is a lot of the individuals recruited under the IEI were still active, and as we'll get to, are now some of them even serving in highest ranking areas in the U.S. government.
So before we get into the individuals, I want to give sort of like a real life example of how this influence campaign has played out in the U.S. And it seems that the success of it in the Biden administration can certainly be seen through the easing, waiving, and lifting of U.S. sanctions, which under Trump was the maximum pressure campaign. But since then, it's been basically obliterated, as you point out, with hundreds of billions of dollars in oil revenue and sanctions relief flowing to Iran. And then, in fact, you wrote a recent column entitled "How an Iranian Influence Campaign Infiltrated U.S. Congress." And you point out that one Iranian-backed fighter in Syria stated, and you sort of referred to this a couple minutes ago, that the golden days are gone and will never return because Iran doesn't have enough money to give us. So as the Hamas attack proves, Biden's reversal of the maximum pressure sanctions opened the spigot of funds which flowed through Iran to Hamas to fund the killing of Jews. Going back to your article, you discuss how the Iranian regime used COVID as a means to further their propaganda campaign by claiming that U.S. sanctions were blocking Iran from getting help to deal with the health crisis, despite rejected offers by the U.S. to send aid. So can you share with us exactly how Iran used COVID as its propaganda machine to influence U.S. policy and the role that Congress played in that case? Because I think it is a good example of how the IEI works or worked.
So if I take you back all to 2019, U.S. sanctions have just come back into place, and they're far stricter than Iran anticipated or thought possible. And their economy started contracting massively, and they had about $90 billion of their assets frozen abroad. What the Supreme Leader did was he tasked the Foreign Ministry with enacting a public relations campaign twinned with their foreign policy to try to get those assets unfrozen. Ultimately, the issue they had was they no longer had the budget to fund their terror programs, and they needed a way around that. And so the campaign that Foreign Minister Zarif launched was spreading the message that, one, sanctions don't work because they don't like the message that it actually hurts the regime. But when they do work, it restricts Iran's ability to have medicine, have food, to take care of their people, and that it hurts innocent Iranians. anyone who has actually seen the inner workings of their system knows that's not true. One, because US sanctions don't target food and medicine, and two, because the food and medicine that Iran does receive from abroad are overwhelmingly sold on the black market to raise funds for the regime. They are given to the regime elite. They are given to the regime's terror arm and military. They don't reach everyday people. And so this was, again, a line that got a lot of resonance among global reporters in the West, in the United States, in Europe, and in the New York Times, which might not surprise folks today. When COVID hit, foreign ministers really saw this as an opportunity to double down on that narrative. And what they did is they actually formed a central propaganda hub on a site called Corona 2 Plus. And they used that to coordinate all their messaging. They had graphics, they had talking points, and it was sent out to all their ambassadors abroad to write and use these graphics on all their websites and try to get op-eds placed. Again, the whole point of this was to get money unfrozen, to get sanctions relief. But they had no interest and no plans to use that money for medicine. In fact, the Supreme Leader had actually been asked to send €1 billion to the Ministry of Health. And instead of doing so, he sent the money to double the budget of the Besieged, which is the domestic route squad, and to increase the budget of the IRGC by 32%. Nonetheless, you saw a lot of folks, including Robert Malley and his deputy outside of government at the time, Ali Vaez, write articles, and these were, among others, arguing that US sanctions had hurt Iranians' access to medicine. That wasn't the case. That wasn't true. And yet they were repeating those talking points. Ultimately, there was a letter signed by 31 senators and representatives, mostly in the progressive wing, including the squad, wrote to the State Department in which they repeated a lot of the lines from Iran's central propaganda hub. Effectively, Iran's messaging campaign had worked so well through various proxies and experts that they got members of Congress to repeat their own lies, which were not substantiated by any evidence. That, to me, is the most successful influence operation campaign you can ever want, is that you have members of your enemy's parliament and Congress, in our case, repeating their own talking points. That's how a good information operation works.
Great. So I'm glad you brought up Robert Malley because he's the starting place, I think, on this U.S. infiltration by IEI members. Robert Malley, for those who don't know, served as Biden's Iran envoy. I say served in the past tense because he has quietly been placed on leave by the Biden administration earlier this year with his security clearance revoked, and he's now under investigation by the FBI. I mean, we've heard nothing about him other than the fact that he's still listed on the website of the Yale-Jackson School of Global Affairs as a senior fellow, which is, I guess, not surprising since it's Yale. I also just want to point out that my friend Ed Lasky wrote an extensive piece at the American Thinker website in 2008 about the shady past and ideology of Malley when candidate Obama hired him on his foreign policy team. That article and learning more in general about Malley's anti-Semitic and anti-Israel pro-Hamas past is well worth revisiting, including Malley speaking with admiration of Hamas and claims that it's a charitable organization and that none of them are crazies. But Ed was extremely prescient when he stated the following, and it pertains to our topic today. Ed stated, through his writings, Malley has served as a willing propagandist, bending the truth and more to serve an agenda that is marked by anti-Israel bias. He heads a group of Middle East policy advisors for a think tank funded in part by anti-Israel billionaire activist George Soros, and now is on the foreign policy staff of a leading presidential contender. Each step up the ladder seems to be a step closer towards his goal of empowering radicals and weakening the ties between America and our ally Israel. Since Ed's column, Malley continued to move up the ranks, culminating in his position with Biden. So can you talk about Malley, the various roles that he's played in both the Obama and Biden administrations that have perhaps threatened our national security and certainly threatened Israel's? And I also want to point out that you stated in a New York Post column recently that Malley and others created an incredibly permissive environment for Hamas, for Iran to do all these things. So please share with us what you know about Malley and U.S. Iran policy.
So Malley is a Harvard, Yale educated individual. Again, I have no personal animus against him in particular. Everything that I'm commenting about Malley is basically in his role in relation to serving in the U.S. government, which, in my view, opens you up to fair criticism. He served in President Clinton's NSC, worked on some of the Israel negotiations, and said at the time, basically echoed what again has been characterized to me as defending Yasser Arafat and defending that position. In 2008, he was on President Obama's campaign. He was fired ultimately for his ties and meetings with Hamas, and that you referenced. And in an interview, he basically said, "Look, they're very misunderstood. They're deeply embedded in Palestinian society. They do charitable things, and they have rationality." I think that's a stretch, to say the least. He ultimately ended up being President Obama's, in the second term, the Iran negotiator for the JCPOA at the State Department and NSC, at the NSC, and then was appointed Iran envoy in 2021 against the protests of large numbers of Iranian Americans, dissident groups, who are very concerned about how he has sort of looked the other way for a number of Iranian aggressions, and how he's effectively repeated Iranian talking points in his private communications. That's extended into his time in office. His posts on social media were, as the kids these days say, were ratioed, meaning that so many people Iranians posted negative comments saying everything you're saying about Iran is false. It was really one of the most unprecedented instances where I've seen a diplomat working on a country being completely, frankly, not respected and even despised by the people on both sides of the ocean who he was allegedly representing. The concerns I have are primarily policy, that the first things that they did in office were to rescind all the pressure on Iran. They stopped enforcing oil sanctions for 15 months. Entirely, there were 0 oil sanctions for 15 months, almost no sanctions at all. And dozens of small and large concessions were given to Iran. The result was that he wasn't even able to net the deal that he was seeking, which was the restoration of the 2015 JCPOA. The issue being that the Iranian leaders thought, we are getting everything that we wanted from the United States without having to make a deal. We can export all the oil we want. We can take pot shots at American forces in the region without reprisal. So why would we need a deal when the status quo is good enough? And ultimately, I think that's what caused the breakdown in talks, was Iran thinking that it could get away, and it did get away with all this activity. As we'll get to, I think, in your next question, I imagine, there were so many warning signs. There were so many people inside government telling me personally, saying Malley is not representing U.S. interests here. And the way they represented it to me was they were sort of saying he's acting like an intermediary between the U.S. and Iran rather than representing the interests of the United States, which is his job and his authority.
Yeah, I mean, it's shocking, and I think the story gets more shocking as we go along. But so, do you think he was placed on leave because the administration became aware that the story was about to break and they needed to cover themselves? I mean, they're doing a really good job of keeping the whole Malley fiasco a secret. Although I did just read, actually, that maybe it was a tweet that you sent out, Gabriel, that he's being subpoenaed by the House Oversight Committee. So do we think we'll ever get to the bottom of what exactly happened with him and why he was secretly let go and lost his security clearance?
So the very strange part of the story is that we know most of what is publicly available is not from the administration. They haven't told Congress any of this. It is from the Tehran Times, which is a state-run media outlet, propaganda outlet. They released a memo that I believe is authentic, that was sent from diplomatic security to him on April 23rd of this year, informing him that his clearance had been suspended due to personal conduct, mishandling of classified information, and mishandling of information technology, which is sort of your classified network systems on your computer. That was withheld from Congress for 2 months. Congress requested to have him brief members of Congress in classified session, and the response was given that he was sick or on some family leave, when in reality, the reason was that his clearance had been suspended. The public didn't know that he was suspended for over 2 months. And my view is that the administration was hoping that this would go away, that either his clearance would be restored or that perhaps he would resign, and hoped that Congress would never learn about this. There's a difference in my view between, say, a very low-level junior staffer who has a clearance suspended, maybe for drug use or something, where the government says, we don't disclose personnel records. That's fair, that's government policy. There's a difference there between that and the senior U.S. government official working on Iran, who is an undersecretary level equivalent in the State Department, having their clearance suspended. Again, Congress was lied to repeatedly by senior members of the State Department. And so, yes, this was frankly a cover-up. They were hoping that Congress would never learn about it. And when it happened, they, again, hid behind this idea that records are private. And as a result, we've had to learn more from the Iranians about what's happening with our own personnel than we've learned from this administration. On that, it's a good question. How did the Iranians get it? My view is that it's likely that the Iranians hacked U.S. government emails and are using those to weaponize them. I certainly hope that no U.S. government employee would leak the Iran Times, which is, again, a state propaganda outlet.
So another high-level government official involved in the IEI is Iranian Ariane Tabatabai, a former aide to Malley at the State Department, who's now serving in the Pentagon as Chief of Staff to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, and who advises the Defense Secretary on counterterrorism. Tabatabai's father is a close associate of former Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and was photographed with the grandson of Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder and leader of the 1979 revolution. In 2016, she co-wrote an article arguing that the U.S. should ally with Iran against ISIS, working together militarily and sharing intelligence. In 2021, when she was brought in as a senior advisor to the Office of the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, several lawmakers demanded that the Biden administration revoke her security clearance and conduct an investigation into her ties to the Iranian regime. But the Biden administration ignored those calls. Lee Smith characterized the situation as follows. The Biden administration allowed Malley to push an Iranian agent into sensitive national security positions because she was best equipped to carry out the administration's own policy, to appease a terror regime with American blood on its hands. Because the number of American officials who want to be responsible for protecting Iran's nuclear weapons program is limited, the White House went outside the federal bureaucracy for someone who was well connected to the regime and would relish the job of advancing its interests. So can you share, Gabriel, what we've learned about Tabatabai from the cache of emails, maybe share some of the outrageous statements and ideas she's promoted and explain her role in influencing U.S. policy?
Certainly. I will say at the outset, I don't agree with everything that Lee wrote, but let me sort of back up and talk about Ariane. She has been a talented Iran analyst. Her writings were informative, thoughtful on many issues. However, there were lots of issues where you would see something and say, that sounds like Iranian propaganda. And now it appears that it was. What we now know is that in 2014, Dr. Tabatabai joined the Iran Experts Initiative, and she would consult Foreign Minister Zarif's top advisor on very sensitive issues. For one, she asked permission whether she should go to Israel. She had been invited to attend a lecture, a workshop, and she said basically that she wanted to counter the propaganda of Israelis at this, and asked whether she should go. She asked whether she should go. It'd be prudent to go to Saudi Arabia. The one that concerned me the most is she was set to testify before Congress, and she told the Iranians, "Hey, I'm testifying before Congress in a couple of days. And then basically asked for the talking points of what she should tell Congress from the Iranian foreign ministry. None of that was disclosed to Congress. And the fact that we had someone advising members of Congress on what were effectively Iranian talking points should concern every American. That to me is completely disqualifying for someone to work in the US government. The family ties are deeply concerning. If anyone was, parent was close friends with Putin or close friends with Xi Jinping, they would not be allowed in the US government. They simply would not. And I've tried to hire people in the Senate whose grandparents were still back in South Korea, for example, and they couldn't get a clearance. That wasn't what was too much. The idea that someone like this could have a clearance and given these ties to the regime is completely, in my view, disqualifying. I'm not saying that she is a spy handing over documents. I'm saying that she is someone who is intellectually compromised and diplomatically compromised in the sense that the Iranian foreign ministry, has info on her that the US government likely did not. She certainly should not be in the position she is as the chief of staff for special operations. There are a lot of things that office does relating to Iran, some of which are public and some of which are not public. And again, a security clearance is not a privilege. It is, it's not a right. It is a privilege if you can advance the national security views of the US government. In this case, the risk is far too high. And again, she simply shouldn't be in government. But with and there have now been several letters from members of Congress to the Pentagon demanding an investigation of her clearance. And the Pentagon has come back and basically said, shove off, that we're not interested in doing anything here. That, to me, is a level of callousness and lack of seriousness that is completely inappropriate for the Department of Defense. Again, if you want to go have her work on Peru issues, maybe that's one thing, but not Iran when there's this level of confidence. It's also, now here's where there's some nuance, I think. Tabatabai was hired by Malley. However, Tabatabai resigned in protest over Malley's conduct in appeasement of the regime. This is one of the reasons I don't believe she is a spy. I'm told by a number of individuals that basically she thought that Malley was appeasing the regime too much. So there is a level of nuance here, but again, has no business being in U.S. government.
I was going to ask about the security clearance and what was happening with that. It's shocking to me that she got it, and that I know in 2021, Ned Price defended her, saying, "Oh, she's been vetted and she's fine, and anybody that's questioning is a racist." Basically, that's not the word he used, but something to that effect. So it is shocking. But
and on that, really quickly, I will say the U.S. government's security vetting of individuals is not very good. Without going into much more detail than that, I do not have a lot of trust and faith and confidence in our security adjudication process. A lot of the times they get things wrong. All you need to know is that 19-year-old Massachusetts National Guard kid who was posting top secret information all over the internet was given a top secret security clearance. And even when his supervisors had noted multiple times that he was mishandling information, they didn't take his clearance away. We have a problem in the U.S. government about how we give security clearances.
Amazing. So Tabatabai's co-author from the days of her proposal to have the U.S. ally with Iran is Ali Vaez, currently a senior Middle East advisor to George Soros's International Crisis Group, and was also involved in the IEI. I mean, the connection between the International Crisis Group and the IEI, it's almost like they were one and the same at certain points in time. Vaez joined the crisis group in 2012 and served as Malley's deputy there. One of the emails revealed Vaez swearing allegiance to the Iranian foreign minister Zarif, who has bragged that he used Vaez to influence Western negotiators. Malley attempted to bring Vaez into the State Department, but thankfully in this case, he was denied clearance. One thing he wasn't denied, however, was access to the White House, as we recently learned that Vaez visited the Biden White House at least 5 times for high-level meetings with senior U.S. officials, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and NSC's coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa, Brett McGurk, both of whom have played critical roles in negotiations with Iran, including the payment of the $6 billion ransom. So can you discuss now Vaez's involvement with the Biden-Iran policy, and do you think the administration was aware of his role with IEI? And also, do you believe that the Soros Crisis Group continues to influence Biden's State Department policy?
So Ali Vaez is an Iranian American. He's a professor or associate professor at Georgetown. Again, very smart individual. That's not the problem. The problem is that he was recruited into the IEI as one of the founding members. And in one email to Zarif, as you mentioned, basically says, I have a loyal and patriotic duty to Iran to help you in any way that I can. That individual has then been advising Rob Malley, who was Rob Malley's deputy for Iran and the crisis group, had an enormous level of access to the White House. And this is the part that concerns me the most, was given a large amount of non-public confidential information by the White House and by the State Department. For example, in August, when the New York Times announced the $6 billion hostage deal with Iran, Ali was quoted as being fully knowledgeable of the details of the arrangement and was effectively briefing the New York Times on all the details of the hostage deal. Members of Congress were not briefed on that hostage deal. Members of Congress and their staffs were not given any information, even upon request and repeated requests from the administration. So the fact that someone like this, who again has sworn loyalty to the Iranian foreign ministry, has access to this should concern everyone. It's also not the right way the U.S. government distributes information. It should be to Congress first, and then everyone else. And if those people have any business having that information. The crisis group Malley was the president and CEO of the crisis group for many years. Look, there are some programs they run which are fine. Their Iran program has largely been an ally of Foreign Minister Zarif. They echo Iranian propaganda. They echo Iranian what I call strategic thinking. They present Iran's view of the world and their view of themselves as victims who need to have their security maintained. It's the same line that a lot of us have heard with Russia saying, "Oh, we deserve our sphere of influence. We deserve our breathing room." We shouldn't give the Russians that largesse, and we certainly shouldn't give the Iranians that largesse. And the International Crisis Group has done an immense amount of legwork for the Iranian regime in advancing its own propaganda views among the strategic community, the United States, and in Europe. The other issue, and I think there's a lot here that hasn't been reported, is the way that Ali Vaez and Rob Malley worked together at the State Department, even when Ali was not part of the U.S. government. There are allegations that he effectively wrote Malley's tweets. There's allegation he was somehow at the Vienna negotiations in 2021 and 2022, talking to Russians, perhaps on our behalf. Again, acting as sort of some weird intermediary. That's not the role of outside think tankers, and especially ones with this past.
So there are a number of questions in the queue, and I want to get to some of them, but I want to ask you first, if you believe there will ever be a mea culpa of sorts, a self-reflection at the State Department that we were just majorly duped, basically infiltrated by Iranian agents who have influenced our Iran policy, and we need to take a step back and put all of this on hold until we understand more. And by this, I mean, continuing down the path of Iranian appeasement. I'm guessing the answer to that is no, since the Obama-Biden ideology seems part of the Democrats' DNA at this point. But do you think Obama and Biden hired Malley because they too believed in the realignment of the region, that empowering Iran at the expense of our allies was a good idea? Or did Malley and others bring that ideology to the two administrations, sort of the chicken and egg question?
So it's important to also understand that Malley went to high school with Secretary Blinken. They are close childhood friends. This is personal for some of them. So the idea that they would actually have a reflection that they are wrong, I think is quite unlikely. Perhaps in Blinken's memoirs, he will admit that their policy has been a catastrophic failure, which has led to everything we are seeing in the Middle East. But I'm not going to hold my breath, and I probably won't buy the book. The other issue here is these folks have all been among each other, influencing each other's thoughts, strategies for the better part of 2 decades now. And so they've convinced themselves that they are right. And one of the things that Secretary Blinken pledged at the start of his administration was that he was going to bring in a diverse team to advise him on Iran, that he understood that Malley was controversial, and so he pledged, we're going to bring some people in who don't agree with him. All those people resigned in protest. There were 3, if not 4, political appointees who resigned within the first year of the Biden administration on Iran. That is unprecedented. That never happened in any office of the State Department that I worked in. And again, on something of such importance should be deeply concerning. You had another part to your question.
Well, I was focused on the chicken and the egg, but also whether there's any self-reflection maybe at the State Department, which would cause them to put the Iranian appeasement, pursuing this nuclear deal on hold. I actually heard from Inbar this morning on a webinar, think that the Biden administration is moving full steam ahead with Iran.
Well, look, at the end of the day, Iran is directly responsible for the murder of 30 Americans, kidnapping of perhaps a dozen or more Americans in the Gaza Strip right now. The idea that the United States should not respond kinetically to that, to me, is abhorrent. There have now been, as of March, there were 84 attacks by Iranians and their proxies against Americans and our interests in the Middle East. We have responded 4 times. The issue is Iran believes, rightly, that it can get away with attacking Americans and killing Americans because it has gotten away. And the Biden administration refuses to put an economic cost, a diplomatic cost, or a military cost on Iran for its actions. And frankly, until these individuals are out of the White House, I think they're gone. One other thing I will note, and this is from my experience having worked for these individuals. At the end of the day, the president and the Secretary of State are the ones that call the shots. They say yes to the policy. And it's the job of the special envoy or special representative to provide options to the president and to the secretary and to ultimately execute on their options. This is on the president and the Secretary of State as well for acquiescing to these decisions that have really led us to this point. Malley is certainly to blame, but he's not alone in that blame.
Yeah. So before I get to the questions, you tweeted something out on Sunday that I just want to raise because it was really shocking. You tweeted about the Islamic Education Center of Houston. And I have to say that I know what goes on in our country's mosques, but watching these videos that you posted of hundreds of Muslim children in Houston, dressed in traditional Arab garb and singing an ode to Qasem Soleimani and Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, with lyrics, "I will be your soldier, I will be your martyr." I mean, it was really shocking to watch that. I'm sure many of our audience members follow Memory, and we see videos of what goes on in the territories, in Gaza with little children being brainwashed. But Houston, and then you pointed out that this has been going on for at least a decade, and it's not limited to Houston. There's videos with children wearing keffiyehs and talking about the occupation of Palestine while pledging allegiance to Khamenei from other parts of the country. So, I mean, it certainly helps to explain the multitudes of pro-Hamas protesters across the country, but how extensive is this indoctrination in young Muslims in the US, and what can we do about it, if anything? I mean, presumably Iran is funding diaspora indoctrination as part of its influence peddling scheme. So is there a financial means of addressing this, sanctions? What can be done?
So I like to personally differentiate. I don't think this is very Muslim at all. I think this is all about Iranian influence, and I think that's the heart of my problem. I know many Muslims who despise the regime. In fact, all the Muslims I know despise it quite heavily, including all those in Iran. Often are the ones that despise it the most. What happened here is over 44 years ago, there was a foundation called the Alavi Foundation, which was set up by the Shah to advance Iran's cultural diplomacy in the United States. After the revolution, Supreme Leader Khomeini, the first Supreme Leader, took control of that foundation and started using it to spread Iranian propaganda and establish sort of a network of control of various mosques and religious institutions in the United States. For many of them, he appointed representatives to actually run these organizations, and it was run by the Iranian ambassador to the UN for decades. That foundation funded this Islamic Education Center in Houston. They funded one in Potomac, Maryland, in Manassas, Virginia, and elsewhere around the country. And again, yes, they do some Islamic teachings, but most of it is about pledging loyalty to Khamenei and Khomeini, praising Soleimani, and attacking Israel and Saudi Arabia, who are, again, geopolitical enemies of Iran. When I grew up going to churches, there was no discussion of America's geopolitical enemies in sermons. That is not a common feature. This center also hosts Cub Scout packs where they rail against U.S. sanctions, talk about the evil superpowers, U.S. and Israel. I was an Eagle Scout. That is not how any scouting program that I am aware of operates. And so, yes, these are Iranian influence operations. Their sermons include snippets from Press TV, which is Iran's main propaganda channel in English, which was just sanctioned by the Biden administration. And so, in my view, these are things which are not only un-American, they are likely illegal because they're supporting a state sponsor of terrorism, Iran. And so I certainly hope that the FBI and Department of Justice look into this. Again, not to get political, they shouldn't be investigating parent-teacher meetings. They shouldn't be investigating Catholic churches. They should be investigating again, I don't care about the religion aspect. I care about the foreign influence of foreign monies, particularly from an enemy of the United States, coming in and indoctrinating children, potentially for attacks against American citizens. We know that Iran has assassination plots up against Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, my former boss, Brian Hook, and about 10 others. These are ideal individuals who would go and execute such things. So we need to get serious here in the United States about disrupting these plots.
Yeah. So a lot of people have asked, a number of people have asked that I think people just can't get their head around the whole Malley thing. And is there any news about the investigation into his security breaches? Any expected replacement? Given the administration, do we expect anything to come of the FBI investigation into Malley? Again, I'm glad that the House Oversight Committee has now subpoenaed him or is about to subpoena him. So do you think anything, or people seem a little cynical about whether anything's really going to come of this?
So, what the FBI does is usually in a black box until you get an indictment, hopefully, or at some point they decide not to press charges. In my experience, that is always, again, a black box. You don't know. So I've no way of judging that. There's a separate investigation, which is now basically up to the State Department of saying, does he deserve his clearance or should that be pulled? If it is pulled, Malley gets the opportunity to then appeal it. That goes to a final adjudicative process, and their answer is final. It is not beyond plausibility that he could have his clearance returned by the State Department and he goes back into office. That's possible. One thing to note, the House of Representatives passed an amendment 3 weeks ago that would reduce his salary to $1, basically saying if you put him back, he's not getting a salary. It would be shocking to me that they would put someone like that back in office without giving the American people a full accounting of why he was suspended in the first place.
Someone asked, this reminds me of the 1940s when some American officials were found to be Soviet spies as documented by Haynes and Clares. Can you comment on this parallel? And I'll just mention, I'm not sure who it was, but somebody made an Alger Hiss, it might have been Lee Smith, made an Alger Hiss comparison as well. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, here's the way I would phrase it. Russians have espionage operations in the United States, and they have influence operations in the United States. No one is out there denying that that's the case. The Chinese government has influence operations and espionage operations on U.S. soil, and no one denies that is the case. For some reason, the moment you replace those words with Iran, you get this whole outcry from journalists, and you get this whole outcry from a bunch of people saying, "No, I don't know what you're talking about. This is all innuendo and accusation." The notion that a nation of 84 million people and a very elaborate and well-funded security and military apparatus would not have espionage and influence operations in the United States is preposterous. That's just what nations do. So do we. We have espionage operations all over the world. That's what a good CIA, that's what a good intelligence operation does. So first, I think it's important to say, yes, there are some. Now let's look, where are they? How do they operate? What are their interests? It's kind of, it's sort of the follow the money type of response. In this case, I say follow the Iranian interests. What is in Iran's interest? What ideas would they want to advance? And look and say, who are advancing those arguments and how are they getting paid and who are their associates? Again, I'm not calling for any, I don't believe that just because you're an Iranian American, you should be investigation. I worked with a lot of really talented, really passionate Iranian Americans who are 100% loyal to our government and who fought against our enemies every single day. My issue is with people who are intellectually compromised or potentially intelligence compromised by the government. And yes, there are some. I don't have the intelligence, the classified intelligence to know exactly everyone that's involved. But I think a large amount of the media and think tank community is delusional and thinks that there's nothing going on.
But do you think that emanates from the Obama-Biden team and the sort of dangerous obsession with Iran and entering into a new agreement, realigning the Middle East? It's all tied together, no?
The issue is what happened in 2014 and 2015 of trying to push this deal before Congress, that the administration started aligning with a lot of actors who did not have the U.S. best interests at heart. They were advancing Iran's interests. And for the Obama administration, there's a temporary alignment of interests. They wanted to get this deal across the finish line. And so they started meeting and they started cooperating and sharing talking points. We have a bunch of organizations which didn't really care about the Obama side of the house. They cared about the Iranian side of the house. And at the time, the Iranians wanted this deal through. The problem is that they socialized and they started talking and mixing together to a degree where now lots of folks in the Biden administration, and again, in some in the progressive movement, trust and think that these people are just trying to advance U.S. national security interests. And that's not the case.
So Sarah Stern, our founder and president, has asked, Robert Malley was expected to appear before Congress after his security clearances were taken away, and the U.S. Department of State actually covered up for him and said that there was a serious illness in his family. Is it legal for the U.S. Department of State to lie before Congress?
So good question. And there are penalties if you are sworn in. So if you are at a hearing and you're sworn in, that is a criminal offense to lie. It is not a criminal penalty if you are, say, a State Department official and you write in an email that eventually comes out as untrue. That should be disqualifying for that individual to work in any particular place, and there's a political cost for it. There's not a criminal penalty. Here's one thing I would add, and I happen to know the individuals that lied to Congress, and I'm not going to name them because I'm told that those people are not malicious actors trying to deceive people. My concern is who told that person. This is something that the Secretary of State would have known about. The Secretary of State would know if their Iran envoy, who happens to be his best friend from high school, has been suspended. Secretary Blinken has a responsibility to figure out the best way that is conveyed to Congress, conveyed to the public in an open and transparent manner. He did not do any such thing. And his counselor, who is currently up for the #3 job at DOD, I doubt is the person who would be sort of delegated with that responsibility. And it does not appear that he did any of this. So there is deep rot and deep mishandling of what happened in this execution. Again, some of this is a little wonky of personnel policy, but as someone who was in the Secretary's office for 2 years on these issues, there are special procedures. There are and that have to be followed painstakingly. It's not always easy, but this was not a little innocent mistake. This was, in my view, an intentional cover-up from the top, from the Secretary. Perhaps even the President was briefed on this. I'm not sure.
Someone asked, why is Biden still willing to make deals with Iran even after Malley is gone?
So there is a naivete, I think, in the highest levels of government that we have to appease Iran because of their nuclear program, and that we can't afford to have a nuclear confrontation while we have the war with China, with Russia, and a potential war with China. And therefore, we have to push this ball down the road. My view is when you kick the can down the road, it is a snowball that starts an avalanche, and it becomes a much more difficult process. The Biden, again, in my view, the Biden administration needs to cut out these negotiations. We are obsessed in this administration with talking. We send 4 different cabinet secretaries to Beijing to try to open dialogue with China and have all these policy concessions to have these meetings. We've had policy concessions to meet with the Iranians. We've had concessions to meet with the Russians to try to prevent their war. We are giving concessions right now to Venezuela and allowing them to pump oil to have meetings. This is not an appropriate policy. This is not how a superpower ought to behave. Countries ought to make concessions to meet with us, not the other way around. We have power, we have the influence if we're willing to exercise that authority. And we haven't seen it yet. I'm just going to plug in my laptop really quickly, but you can ask your question.
Yeah, it's almost time. I'm going to ask you 1 or 2 more questions because we're getting close to 1. Gabriel, is there any evidence that these American Iranians received funds or other material inducements from Iran?
So there's indications that they received free airfare and lodging, perhaps in Tehran itself. If that's the case, that is illegal under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. Some of these think tankers have, since their organization, said, nope, we paid for everything. I don't really trust them at their word. I'm very curious to see that. The Department of Justice has indicted Iranian agents in the United States. On January 19th, 2021, the Department of Justice arrested a college professor up in Boston who was getting paychecks from the Iranian mission at the UN and was writing opinion articles in US papers. He wrote, I think, a dozen letters and op-eds in the New York Times, and never declared that he was an Iranian agent. Here's the link between him and those other people. He co-authored repeatedly with one of the top professors at Princeton, who was the former Iranian ambassador to the UN. That professor has co-authored with Ali Vaez. If you do the degrees of association, all these people have co-authored with known Iranian foreign agents and foreign officials. They're all in a tight network together. They all talk to each other. And the smart ones don't leave a trail that can get them indicted by the Department of Justice. The issue is that our major papers, our major think tanks, and our U.S. government officials don't call them for what they are, which is Iranian agents. They can be Iranian agents. They can be propaganda agents. We have freedom of speech here. And if you declare that you are the case, that's okay. But they should be transparent about what they are. And the media and American experts need to be transparent and say, look, they are advancing Iranian interests. They have that right under the Constitution, but that's exactly what they are. They shouldn't pretend, as they often do, to be neutral experts.
Thank you, Gabriel. I want to just share with everybody that we're going to have a webinar tomorrow morning with Brigadier General Amir Avivi of the IDF for an update on the war. That's, I believe, at 9 a.m., and you can sign up for that. I cannot thank you enough, Gabriel, for joining us this afternoon. You were, as I expected, full of information, and I wish we had maybe another hour to go over some of the more details, but we'll bring you back another time. And thank you for all the work you do. I encourage everybody, please, to follow Gabriel's work. You can follow him on Twitter. You'll learn a lot from doing so. So thank you all for joining this afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. Have a good afternoon.